Hi, my name's Nicholas and I live on a 102-year-old wooden boat, Argonaut II. A century ago, this boat served as a lifeline for northern British Columbia's remote coastal communities, and this summer I've journeyed north to retrace her history and meet dozens of people who have intimate connections with the boat over the years. This week's episode is very special because 3 of those people actually came aboard and shared their experience. Phil Little, who was the engineer on this boat from 1959 to 1961, and Bob and Joan Burrows, who lived aboard this boat as minister from 1960 to 1962. We'll also get an exclusive tour of the boat St. Roch here at the Vancouver Maritime Museum, where they are hosting me at the Heritage Harbor docks for a couple days so that I can open Argonaut up to the public for some tours. We'll start out with a very special moment where I met in person Phil Little, who came aboard to share his experience on Argonaut II back when it was a mission boat and named Thomas Crosby IV.
My name is Phil Little, and I first joined the boat, Thomas Crosby IV, in July 1959 as a deckhand, and then I became the engineer. I lived on the boat. At times I would take the boat by myself out of Ocean Falls and go over to Bella Bella and spend a day or two off. Had a great time, loved all the places and the people. And I just loved it. It's not like it used to be, that's for sure. Well, the whole coast is different than what it used to be. It was alive, full of people.
So let me tell you how I met Phil. I actually ran into him on my way north at the beginning of my trip, where he and his wife were sailing southbound after an early summer cruise on their sailboat. And we were passing through Dent Rapids, which is one of those narrow pinch points. And so you have to cross through Dent Rapids at slack water, and you have about a 4-minute window to do so. And so as I'm going north and they saw me, Phil ended up calling me on the radio and told me I was the engineer on that boat in 1959. As we were parting ways, he gave me his phone number, and I called him a month and a half later on my way back south towards Vancouver.
I remember one time at Christmas, we went to a dinner in Namu. There were a couple of hundred people for Christmas dinner. Now there's nothing left. But it was just a booming place. Of course, Rivers Inlet was booming. Pruth Harbor and Ocean Falls. Went around King Island and went into Yukot Bay. And I don't think there's anything left in Yukot Bay. I guess the hot springs are still there. But there was an old barge that pulled up on the beach there, and Frenchie and Simpson lived in the barge. And, you know, the coast was full of A-frame loggers, just people living. Things have certainly changed. The minister would do funerals, of course, and weddings and christenings. It was a church, a floating church. We would go south out of Ocean Falls for, 10, 12, 14 days, and then we'd be back to Ocean Falls for 3, 4, restock, and the minister would be home because he had a house there in Martin Valley. And then we would head from there north. We'd go to Ivory Island, and Clem 2, Butedale, Boat Bluff. We spent quite a bit of time in Hartley Bay. And they had a band there called the Hartley Bay Five. Get on the Quatsu, which was an old singer, go to different places and perform, and for dances or whatever, right?
Because he was the engineer, I of course asked him about the Gardner engine, which I believe has somewhere in the realm of 120 to 150,000 hours on board.
I thought we did enough travel hours to go around the world in the time I was on the boat.
And if this boat ran the same amount that it did when Phil was on board through its entire time as a mission boat, I think that estimate is likely accurate.
How many gallons are you going through?
About 2.1 to 2.2.
That's about it.
An hour.
Yeah, that's about 9 knots.
All out, I can get the boat to about 8.2.
Oh, you see, we always ran 9.
No,
we used to run 800 RPM with 9 knots.
What could that be?
Fuel injection.
Fuel injection? As a quick aside, many of you know that the reason for me making this YouTube channel is to help fundraise to perform a couple big restoration projects on this boat. One project is actually to rebuild the fuel injector pumps on the Gardner engine. And I would love to know from you in the comments if this is something that you'd love to see. I'm in talks with Gardner, the company. They'll actually send folks out from England to help me do this project. In order to get there, I need to raise about $20,000 or $30,000, and I'm doing so through a Patreon in my bio, through contributions made by you all. As my conversation wrapped up with Phil, I had the idea of actually taking him out on my trip across the Sound towards Victoria. So I invited him, and in my next episode, we're going to get to go boating with Phil, who drives us across the Strait of Georgia over to Sydney. I have to get to Victoria by Thursday.
Yeah.
Would you and your wife want to come?
I could ask her. You get so retired that but you're so busy anyway. Yeah.
Later that night, and after about 3 months underway, I actually experienced some of my worst weather to date. And while we were tied at the dock, a northerly wind built up a big enough sea state that when the tides went down, the long fetch waves as it entered shallower water hit Argonaut broadside, and it made for a very bumpy night at the dock. We didn't experience too much damage, but a few glasses broke that I had left out on the table, and to my surprise, a bow line snapped, leading to my stern sustaining a little bit of damage from the dock. So, a little bit of a ding damage, so nothing too bad. A little bit of sanding and paint won't fix. That morning, thankfully the weather cleared up, and then we met with David Jordon, who is the director of the Maritime Museum here, and he took us on a special tour of the St. Roch that was famous for its exploration of the Northwest Passage.
I'm David Jordon. I'm the executive director for the Vancouver Maritime Museum. We are the home to a National Historic Site, the St. Roch. It's been here in dry dock since 1959. It was originally an outdoor exhibit, so this railing was the outdoor railing. So let's go take a look at some of the fun stuff about the boat. The St. Roch was built to be a floating detachment for the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and also specifically to make a journey through the Northwest Passage. This was one of the first boats to go through the Northwest Passage. There are many famous failed attempts by European explorers, George Vancouver, who couldn't find it. Sir John Franklin famously, died trying to go through the Northwest Passage. Roald Amundsen, Norwegian, was the first one to actually go through the Northwest Passage, and Captain Henry Lars did go through the Northwest Passage, and of course it was of utmost importance at his time, actually, for defense efforts during World War II.
And here we had a cool opportunity to go down below into the engine room, which is generally closed off to the public, where we got to see just how beautifully the museum has restored the boat to its condition back when it was exploring the Northwest Passage.
This is really neat. These look at the size of these beams here. So this is the other way it doesn't get crushed by the ice.
The Maritime Center is totally worth a visit. It has a whole bunch of other exhibits of all kinds of bits of history, primarily focused on the British Columbia maritime history. It even had an exhibit on the Columbia mission, which is a mission that was run more along the central coast of British Columbia, including a box organ not unlike the one that used to be on Argonaut II back when it was Thomas Crosby IV. In this next segment, I host aboard Bob and Joan Burrows, who lived aboard Argonaut II back when it was called Thomas Crosby IV from 1960 to 1962. What's really fun is Bob makes his own jams to help fundraise money for the United Church, and he brought me a pair. One flavor is an orange marmalade, and the other is a raspberry jam.
This reminds me of the old days.
Well, you got a different radar. I was under the impression that we still had it, and it was one of the last two still working in the world.
What Bob's referring to is the old radar that was in fact one of two operational in the world. A previous owner, about 10 years ago, actually replaced that radar with a more modern one. I'm not sure where it ended up, and so it's a piece of cool technology that was lost in the history in the last decade or so.
My name is Bob Burrows. I'm a United Church minister who was studying for a year overseas in Scotland and got a telegram on the 4th of April, 1960, saying that the United Church Board of Home Missions wants to appoint you as captain of the Thomas Crosby IV, based at Ocean Falls. Stop. 50 ports of call, 11 logging camps, 7 lighthouses, 7 Indian villages, and other fishing camps and isolated families.
Stop.
And I wanted an immediate reply. So Joan and I went for a half-hour walk through the campus at the university and went to the post office and sent our reply and said yes. A few months later, we got back to Canada and drove across Canada and began our life on this boat. The engineer was Phil Little. Jack Goss was the former engineer on the boat that it was my tutor. And then Danny Walkus came on board. He had had his own fish boat for about 5 years. He was a fisherman, but he knew the coast and gave me all kinds of tips about don't bother about the compass. Just look at the top of that mountain and where that crest is. That's what you look at night when you're in Rivers Inlet. Lived in Ocean Falls, and we tended to have 10-day trips, either to the northern part of the region or the southern part, and then 10 days on and 3 or 4 days off, and then back again, so that we covered the whole circuit every 6 weeks. That was our goal. It was a very exciting time, because at that time there was a whole life. There were probably 150 or to 200 small families living in the various logging and fishing communities year-round. We were kind of like the friends. On whether they were interested in the church or not didn't matter. They were so glad to see us and to come on board and have a visit.
And lighthouse keepers.
And the lighthouse keepers,
And,
especially, who are so isolated.
Yeah.
And the watchmen at the canneries in Rivers and Smith Inlet. They often went months without seeing another person.
It's a world that's gone now.
Once the airplanes started taking the loggers in 10 days on, 3 days off, the families lived in places that had schools, like Port Hardy, Campbell River, Prince Rupert. We were very fortunate to be there when we were. Now we're fortunate to celebrate the fact that this boat has been retained and maintained as well as it has. It's a very worthy goal that we hear you describing.
I want to take a moment to correct something that I made a mistake on in an earlier video, where Argonaut, formerly Thomas Crosby IV's primary function was a mission boat, and it was not in fact a full-time medical boat. The hospital in Bella Bella had a dedicated medical boat called the William H. Pierce. Thomas Crosby IV did conduct medical trips for when there was ever someone in need in one of the remote settlements. They often served as transport back and forth to the hospital, and once or twice a year would take a doctor around for visits on some of these remote communities.
What we did on this boat with the hospital was that twice a year, a doctor from the team at the hospital, Bella Bella, came on board for 10 days and went with us as we visited lighthouses and logging camps and a school in a village that no longer exists that had 20 or 30 kids, and they never saw a doctor. It was a very poor village.
Bob and Joan told me a little bit about the layout of the boat as they remembered, and some clear changes were the loss of the library in the galley, some modifications to the head in the aft stateroom, and then also the layout of the chart room.
There was a library in behind the oil stove, shelves and books and so on. A lot of the family, they used it as sort of a library, take stuff out, and then the next trip.
Yeah, it was
I was going to say we dropped
a
off.
modest lending library.
Yeah, I have a picture of you sitting there on your typewriter.
That's right, I have to type my sermons.
So after learning how to operate a boat, Bob's next step in his career was to actually become a pilot, serving as a minister on a float plane with a similar mission of reaching remote communities that didn't have access other than a boat or a plane.
I learned on our own church-owned plane. It was a Cessna 170. The plane was used, just like the boat, to try and reach isolated people that had no access except by boat or air.
Over the course of the summer, when I visited with some of the First Nation communities that this boat served with, I touched on the subject about their relationship with the United Church mission. In my conversation with Bob, it was interesting to hear from his lens the observation of the change throughout his time as a missionary.
The other thing that was really important, within 3 or 4 or 5 years, the whole resurgence of native culture had started to come up in the open. And at Alert Bay, they built the big house, they carved stone poles. We were living there, and our little kids got pictures of them at 2 years of age, standing with the guys carving the poles. And that whole thing was just waiting to happen. And it's never looked back. Well, reconciliation is the word that government uses, the church uses it. And when I was first on the boat, a 65-year-old elder at Hartley Bay, after a cup of coffee on Saturday night and 5 cigarettes, he would start telling me stories. And he was talking about the Creator, and sent their language down, came down from heaven, and the Somaliac language, and yet that same guy spoke good English, and when I wasn't there, he would preach on the Sunday at church, lead the choir, and a few years later, we realized that spiritual value within the First Nations community generally, all that was there even when they were still going to church and singing in the church choirs, but the strength of the positive things in their culture did not get lost. So we were lucky in one way to be there just when it was happening, but also I envy the people that came along a few years later and were able to be more significantly involved in that.
I also really love what I learned next and what Joan was planning next to me during this conversation.
We're having a very large party for Bob for his 90th birthday on Saturday night.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Yesterday, our daughter, who was born when we were on the boat, had her 63rd birthday.
Next, we did a walkthrough through the rest of Argonaut, and I absolutely loved Joan's reactions to the changes and updates that have been made over the years.
I used to put my hand there, even when I was young. Yeah. I don't recall
Oh my goodness.
ever falling. So.
Oh, Nick, I can't believe the galley. Oh my goodness. Oh my heavens. I can't believe it. Oh.
I wonder if it was like this when we were on with Julian.
No, it was not. It was
Have you
not.
done this?
Holy doodle. You have done a wonderful job. Isn't this? Oh, this is just. Oh, that's lovely. And see the picture of the Thomas Crosby as well as the Argonaut?
I did.
For me, this was a really special couple days of my time with Argonaut. And I just want to say a big thank you to Phil, Joan, and Bob for taking their time to share their experience with me, and to David and the Vancouver Maritime Museum for inviting me to spend a couple days at their docks, taking me through a walkthrough of the St. Roch. And I look forward to hopefully some future partnerships where we dig in a little bit deeper about the history of Argonaut and the United Church mission. As most of you know, I'm doing my best to try and fundraise the restoration project and ongoing documentation of the history of this boat. And I'm doing so through Patreon or one-time gifts to my PayPal account, which I've linked in the description of this video. Currently, I'm only about 2.5% on the way to my goal of raising $200,000 to do a massive restoration project on the port side of this boat. But I'd love to hear from you what else you'd like to see, including work done to the Gardner diesel, other questions you might have about the history of the boat, or what other videos would be important to you as I start winding up my cruising season and focus more on boat projects. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.